Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Bamby Salcedo, and I am a very privileged trans Latina immigrant woman who resides in the United States. I was invited to participate in this session to talk about surgical interventions that many of us trans people may choose or may not choose to go through. But I think before I talk about that, I think it's important that I give a little bit of context as to where trans people are positioned within 2020 and what are some of the things that lead us into pursuing some of those surgical interventions, or why not. And so what I think it's important for us to acknowledge the continuous violence that trans and gender nonconforming people experience around the world. As we know, every year there's about 400 trans and gender nonconforming people who get murdered simply because of who we are. We know that our society has placed us in a way that there's very little opportunities for us to live, thrive, and succeed in this world. And because of the lack of opportunities that we get for us to live our lives fully as we are supposed to, or as we are destined to be, many of us have to resort to different things that put our lives in danger. As I mentioned, the majority of trans people, and particularly trans women of color, black and brown trans women, are pushed into work, if you will, in the street economy. And I mean, I'm not going to say necessarily work, but rather do things that we are forced to once again by our society in order for us to survive. And these are the things that happen, right? We know that we lack opportunities trying to get employment or housing or even access to healthcare. And because of this, many of us, and because of the discrimination that we experience, many of us have to resort into surgical interventions in order for us not to be discriminated against, in order for us to try to find some type of opportunities for us to be able to exist in this world. And I myself, for instance, I am 51 years old, and just barely last year had the opportunity to had facial feminization. And for me personally, and as well as many members of my community, I didn't have access. We know that surgeries are expensive, and when we are barely trying to survive in this world, obviously we can't pay for surgeries, right? And it really depends on where you live, for instance, right? Like if you're in a particular part of the world, then a person may not necessarily have the accessibility to get surgeries or the surgeries that they need. But many of us resort to get surgeries because we want to just live, really. We don't want to continuously be harassed. We don't want for us to continuously be discriminated against. And then there's this issue of possibility, right? And then there's this issue of um, depending on when you transition right, is really what dictates how passable you may look to the world, or how much ridicule you would get, or how much harassment you can potentially get. Meaning that if if a person transitions at a later part in their life, for instance, um, a trans woman, right? If a trans woman transitions, let's say in their 30s, right? That person may have already developed some characteristics that may not be able to be reversible with just hormone replacement therapy. And if you transition at an earlier age, as we know, and if we understand um, child development, for instance, or adolescence development, right? We know that our bodies and our brains really continue to develop until we're about 25 years old. And so, if you transition at a later part of your life, if you're a trans woman, there's some things that may not be reversible. And that also is a great cause for us to be discriminated against. And that is why it's important for us to get surgeries, right? And it's also not just the fact that you want it, but also sometimes it's the fact that we need it, right? And so, again, this is very important for us, for many of us, or for some of us. And in my case in particular, um, it was important for me to be able to get surgery because, again, 50 years old, never had like any type of facial feminization or any type of facial surgery. And for me, um, because I was getting older, because because I didn't have access, right? I didn't have a good paying job that would pay for um, my surgeries. I didn't have the opportunity to save up. And so now that I do have the privilege to lead a national advocacy organization in the United States, I am able to get good paying insurance. And that's therefore I'm able to have access to the surgeries that I need for myself. And I think it's important to recognize that, again, it depends where you may be in the world, is the access that you may have. And then, in addition, for many of us to be able to be comfortable with ourselves, right? Um, we also have to, you know, and for the most part, trans women have to engage in the sex industry in order for us um, to have access to money and to have access to those surgeries. Again, for many trans women, the fact that we have to resort to doing sex work as a means to survive, um, it means also that we have to save money in order for us to be also marketable, right? Um, Unfortunately, you know, our community has been sexualized for centuries, right? And for again, for many of us, that's the only um, that's the only jobs that we could get in a society that continues to discriminate against us. And so it's important for us to also recognize that, you know, that we obviously encourage, right, for people to love and accept themselves, right? But when trans people have been always be told that we are not supposed to exist, that we are not supposed to be who we are, that who we are is wrong, then we internalize these things. And this is another thing that also for many of us is important for us to have surgeries, right? Because again, we want to, in some ways, not just better ourselves, our physical self, but we want to eliminate the violence that we also experience. As I mentioned earlier, every year there's about 400 trans and gender nonconforming people who get murdered. And so for us, it's important to, in some ways, conform to what society has said so that we pass, so that we have access to employment, so that we have access to school, so that we have access to other basic things that many of us take for granted, right? Like housing, for instance, right? We know that many of us get discriminated against simply because of who we are and because of how we look. Unfortunately, we live in a society that really looks at how pretty you are. And in the case of a trans person or a trans woman specifically, we judge people on how passable you are, how well you look. And and again, because we live in this binary society, right? That really tells who is supposed to look like a woman or who is supposed to look like a man. And so we want to conform to those things. At least many of us do want to conform to some of that, again, to eliminate the continuous violence that we experience. And I'm saying all of this to say that surgeries are important for some of us, but surgeries is also important for us to decide if that's appropriate for us, right? Despite the fact that how we get to accomplish what we need for ourselves as trans people. We have to do sex work in order for us to save money, for us to have the surgeries that we need, then that's what we are going to do. But what I would encourage for our society to think about is to have access for those of us who do not have the ability or who do not even want to engage in the street economy in order for us to be able to save or for us to be able to survive or for us to be able to conform to what society tells us that we should be. And so it's important that we understand that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order for us to understand, accept, and love the existence of trans people. And so, in closing, I just want to say um, that it's important that we invest in trans lives, but that we invest in a way that is intentional, and that we invest in a way that will provide some type of dignity for trans people who are also part of the human race. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture, and I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and I hope that everything, you know, it's better for all of us. Thank you so much.